Hello, my friends. Lori Ashcraft here again, your host for Viva La Evolution, produced by Recovery and Resilience Solutions, which is sponsored by Crestwood Behavioral Health, and a couple lovely sponsors. And as always, if anyone else wants to be a sponsor, let us know. We'd be happy to have you. There's no cost involved. And I keep forgetting to say this, but please subscribe if you don't mind. That's just a podcast thing and it helps us. So thanks very much. Now, today I have a really amazing guest, Robert Whitaker. You probably know the name because he's written a couple of best-selling books, shining lights on parts of the behavioral health system, all the way up to the research that supports it, and shows us things that we didn't really know until we read his books. Jean and I first heard of him, I think in probably 2012 or 13. And Jean went to a conference someplace. It was a conference of psychiatrists. And Robert did a presentation on his work there. And it significantly impacted everybody there because what he brought to light was absolutely new information. And he had research to back it up. And to make things even better, he doesn't have an axe to grind. He's a journalist, so he's just into trying to find the truth and report it. So he's joining us today, talking about his two books, the two books that I've read. There's a couple I haven't read, but I'm going to. The first book was Mad in America. The second was, I always get this wrong, let me say it right, Anatomy of an Epidemic. Those were the two seminal works that really started shining the light on things a lot of us suspected were wrong, but we didn't know until Robert really pointed it out. He's written another book, Under the Influence, Psychiatry Under the Influence. That's the one I haven't read that I want to read really soon. And then he talks about a study called STAR-D, and I asked him to explain that, and it's really very interesting and a great example of how research can sometimes be shown to say something that isn't actually accurate. Very good example of that. So pay attention to that. Okay, let's get on with it and hear what Bob Whitaker has to say. Hi, Robert. It's so good to see you again. I'm so delighted you had time to speak with us today.
It's a real pleasure being here, Lori. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, you just had such a profound effect on Jean and I with your first books, Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. Those two books, I was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication for probably 25 years. And I read those books and I started trying to get off of them. And it took me 3 years to get off of them. No one tells you how hard it is to get off of those things, but I finally did. So thank you for those two books.
Do you feel better now that you've been
off them? I do. I feel more whole.
Yeah.
I feel like I have more depth of feeling, highs and lows that I really didn't even know I missed.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things about the drugs is you don't know what you're missing sometimes when you've been on the drugs a long time.
Yeah.
And you also did experience what so many people experience. It's not easy coming off once your brain has become accustomed to those drugs.
Really hard. Really hard. Yeah. Well, I was thinking you could maybe start by telling us a little bit about those first two books, just a synopsis. Sure. Maybe why you wrote them or what their main message is.
Sure. So, Mad in America, my first book on the subject, was published in 2002. And it came about in this way. In the late 1990s, in 1998, I was doing co-writing series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And at that time, I had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry, than what it had discovered about the nature of the causes of major disorders and their treatments. I'm talking about their drug treatments, meaning that my understanding at that time was that great progress had been made in discovering the biological causes of depression and schizophrenia, and that they were due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and that they now had drugs that fixed those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. Now,
Because
that's a sound.
you were a journalist and you didn't have an axe to grind on either side. So
No, and
that's
but
what I
when
most
you're
appreciated about.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, and one of the things about coming at this as a journalist is your entry to the story is really through the people you call up, okay, the experts.
Mhm.
So I had stumbled upon some instances where it seemed like patients were definitely being abused in research settings, both those conducted by pharmaceutical companies, but a couple funded by the NIMH as well. But as a context for this, I was talking about the story about what do we know about the causes of schizophrenia, the causes of depression, and what about these drugs? And everyone told me they were like insulin for diabetes, okay? And that's a story of great medical progress, because think about that story. If they had really identified the molecules that cause madness, or the molecule that caused antidepressant, that caused depression, and they could fix that with a drug, that would be, in my opinion, given the complexity of the human brain, the most extraordinary medical advance in the history of medicine. And that's what I believed. And by the way, one of the things we wrote about in that Boston Globe series was that studies in which they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients were unethical, because you would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic to see what happens. So why would you do it to schizophrenia patients? However, while doing that, the research for that series, I did stumble upon a couple of studies that sort of belied that narrative of progress. One was a article published by Harvard medical psychiatrists, school psychiatrists, in which they said the longer term outcomes for schizophrenia patients had actually declined in the last 15 years and were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. Now, that belied this whole story of progress that we believe in with the arrival of the drugs. And then second, and even more powerfully, I came upon studies by the World Health Organization, which twice had done studies comparing outcomes for schizophrenia patients in three, quote, developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, versus outcomes in the US and other developed countries, rich countries.
Yeah.
And each time they found outcomes were much better in the poor countries. So much so that they concluded that living in a developed country is a strong predictor you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I go, wow, why would that be?
Yeah.
And now what happened in those World Health Organization studies after the first one, which I think was 5 years in length, they hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is that the patients are more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotic medications. So they looked at medication usage in the second study, and what did they find? They found that in the poor countries, where the outcomes were so much better, they used the drugs acutely but not chronically. In other words, they used them for a short-term stabilization, but they didn't keep their psychotic and patients diagnosed with schizophrenia on the drugs long-term. So all of a sudden, I was confronted with research findings, replicated research findings, that found outcomes were much better in poor countries where they didn't use the drugs, antipsychotics, long term with most patients. And yet that was the standard of care here in the United States. And not only was the standard of care, it was seen as that anybody who contested that maybe that was the best way to treat all patients was sort of crazy, or a flat earther.
Yeah.
So basically that was the start of my research on MAD in America. I wanted to find out why were outcomes so poor for those we call MAD in the rich countries. And also I wanted to put this narrative of scientific advance under a microscope. And what you find in Anatomy of an Epidemic, which looks at the history of the treatment of the, quote, MAD, since colonial times, you find a couple of things. you find that no matter what the mad doctors or psychiatrists were doing, they always found it was helpful. It didn't matter if they were dunking him in the water or they were tying him up in chairs and bleeding them, or they were doing lobotomies or electroshock or whatever they were doing, they always concluded what they were doing was helpful. That's the first thing. The second thing you found is that throughout this history, therapies that quieted people were always seen as helpful.
Yeah.
That made them most not, less rambunctious or whatever. Now, then I looked at that sort of history of the bad old days of psychiatry are sort of recognized. Although there is a time going back to the early part of the 19th century when we had moral therapy that really emphasized, environmental care, and that had actually produced the best outcomes in psychiatric history with the quote insane or mad.
Yeah.
But then the conventional history is that antipsychotics arrived in medicine in 1955s, and this kicks off a great psychopharmacological revolution. It makes it possible to treat people with schizophrenia, diagnosed with schizophrenia, in the community, and people could, once they lived in the community, they could live sort of fairly normal lives. So it's a story of great medical advance. And that's the conventional narrative.
Yeah.
But what I found in Mad in America, the science doesn't support that narrative. What you find instead is that what emptied the institutions was not the drugs, but rather social policy that made it possible for states to release their patients, who then went to residential centers or nursing homes or whatever, because the federal government then would pay for half the cost of that, and before they wouldn't. So the states basically, by discharging patients, could get rid of some of the financial burden of taking care of people. So you see, it's that policy that really led to the sort of emptying of the asylums. But then at the same time, you see, as you follow the story of research into the impact of the drugs, is that right away after the introduction of the drugs, people start to worry about, well, maybe my patients are getting better quicker, but now they're relapsing more frequently. And you even see a new term come up about the revolving door syndrome.
Yes.
And then what you see going forward from that is there was a retrospective study done that looked at outcomes for 5-year outcomes for patients treated in 1947 without drugs, because they weren't available yet.
Yeah.
To a similar group of patients treated at the same hospital in 1967 with the drugs. And what did they find? Patients in the modern era were much more impaired functionally 5 years later, and they also had higher relapse rates. Then there were 3 studies done in the in the 1970s by the NIMH trying to look at longer-term outcomes for people treated with antipsychotics versus what we might call the natural course of the disorder. Each time they found that outcomes were worse for the medicated patients. Then you get a story about, well, why might that be? And you get researchers saying, well, it's because the drugs induce a biological change that actually makes people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis, and on and on. So what Mad in America does ultimately is it tells a counter narrative to the story of progress.
Yeah.
And you see in that book that the search for to find that schizophrenia was due to dopamine imbalances actually didn't pan out, but it found that the drugs induced the very pathology, an increase in dopamine receptors, hypothesized to cause psychosis, psychotic symptoms in the first place. So rather than fix a chemical imbalance, they actually created it. And then you can keep going forward. But basically, the story is, it's a counter narrative to the story of progress, saying that science, and this is science done by NIMH researchers, the leading researchers in the field, doesn't support the narrative of progress that people were telling. Okay? And that in fact, what we saw in the modern era with drugs were increasing chronicity, lowering of recovery rates, patients hating the antipsychotics often because it made them feel like zombies. And finally, that due to financial influences and guild influences, psychiatry wasn't informing the public of these negative findings.
Oh, no, we never heard anything like that.
Right.
I remember being a social worker in, I guess it was the late 60s, early 70s. in California. And the governor decided, I think it was Governor Reagan at the time, decided that we could save a whole lot of money if we took people out of hospitals. And now that we have these drugs, people could live in the communities. That was more the narrative that the little line worker people like me got. And so we started taking people out, but the money didn't follow them. It stayed in the hospital because you can't just shut down a giant
Sure.
machine like a hospital by taking a few people out. And in Sacramento County, we had almost 1,000 people in state hospitals, and the population of the county was about 400,000. And we got all but 8 people out, and that bounced back up to about 40. And by some miracle, we held it there, but we weren't doing anything very good. We kept getting a little better at it, but initially we just took people out to nothing, to board and care homes, to nursing homes. And I can see what you're talking about with the medication because, and the relapse issue, because people don't like being on them and they go off them.
Exactly.
And then they're unprepared for the storm of chemicals that either comes or goes, and they're really disabled then.
Yeah, that, then that showed up in the late 70s and early 80s. And the researchers said this: once you're exposed to the drugs, your brain undergoes these changes. And that's why you have such severe relapses when you come off. And they even said when this happens, the relapses are more severe and persistent than they were in the natural course of the disorder.
I believe that that syncs with my experience. But of course, what do? We put them on higher doses.
Higher doses, and you find it, if you can keep them on the higher doses and they just sit and do nothing in their daycare homes, that's seen as okay.
Yes, that's okay. That's yeah, and it's used that way. I can't say right now at the moment, but when I was working right there on the front line, um, that was seen as good.
Yeah,
There's
listen,
no problem anymore.
there's where I live in Cambridge, there's a number of these sort of group homes.
Yeah,
And if you go into the group homes, no one's talking to each other. They're mostly
no.
watching TV and they're
Mhm,
smoking cigarettes,
mhm, mhm.
and there's no activity at all. But
Yeah.
and they're medicated out, and a lot of them, frankly, are very heavy too because of the weight that is associated
Yes.
with the use of
Yes.
drugs.
Yes.
So you see unhealthy people not having much of a life, but oh, they're stable.
Right.
But that,
Whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, that's what Mad in America was about. It was about that we as a society organized ourselves around a story that just wasn't true. It wasn't reflective of the science. And of course, you were working in the 1990s when the atypicals came in.
Mm-hmm.
And these were said to be so much greater. Oh wow, than the old drugs. But the research didn't support that either. When you looked at the actual trials that were
Hmm.
results of clinical trials that were sent to the FDA, and I reported on that as well in Mad in America. So Mad in America, really the book was a plea for, can we please know the science?
Yeah.
And if we know the science, maybe we can adjust what we do and how we help people. And part of that is, and there is a message of optimism within Mad in America. And that is, if you go through history, so often people who got a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis or even insanity, it was an episodic problem. It wasn't a
Yeah.
permanent part of their life.
It wasn't forever.
And certainly not for end. So the actually recovery rates for many was fairly decent, right? And this, you can see that over and over again in the literature. And it came out in the 70s, by the way, quite clearly. So there was also a message of hope, or embedded in that book, was that if we did know this research, we could learn to use the drugs more carefully or smartly, sort of selectively for whom and for how long. But we would also understand that you needed to provide environmental worlds that help people get back their lives,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it be employment, socialization, etc. So that was the message in Mad in America, is that science is telling a different story than what is the public is hearing. And if we knew the real story, we could adjust their thinking. But of course, that was sort of a shout against voices that have a lot of prestige in society, and it generates a lot of financial.
Oh,
benefit.
yes, it's the money involved in pharmaceuticals and
It's tremendous.
hospitals. Just
Exactly.
amazing.
So, and then just to finish your first question, Lori, after I wrote Mad in America, whenever you write as a journalist that counters conventional wisdom and counters what people with academic credentials are saying,
Yeah.
you get blasted, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It's not a pleasant thing. So my agent told me at that point, Bob, please write books on other subjects. It's too perilous to write about psychiatry. So I wrote a couple other books out of psychiatry. But what happened was, and they were nonfiction, sort of historical nonfiction books. People kept asking me, what about the kids? Why are so many kids ending up on drugs and getting diagnosed? And what about, where are all the bipolar patients coming from?
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And so so I took up the question in Anatomy of an Epidemic is, as more and more people are getting diagnosed and treated, is the public burden of mental disorders going up? Because if you have diseases and more people are treated for those diseases, you should see a diminishment in the burden of that mental illness. Instead, we were seeing this extraordinary rise in the number of people on disability, et cetera. And then second of all, I wanted to ask this question. Drugs get tested because they, quote, diminish symptoms of the disorder a little better than placebo over the short term. But people take these drugs long term. And what we really want to know is, how is it impacting people long term? And to answer that question, what you basically have to do is flesh out, what is the natural course of the disorder? In other words, if you don't medicate it over longer periods of time, and then compare that to what are we seeing in studies today for medicated patients.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you find over and over again that psychiatric drugs, on the whole, now some people may do fine on them, increase the risk that people will become chronically symptomatic and functionally impaired. Mm-hmm. Now, part of the reasons you see that worsening is because actually in nature, longer-term outcomes for depression are good. Longer-term outcomes for anxiety are good. They're pretty episodic disorders. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even, by the way, even manic depressive illness, bipolar illness, was seen as an episodic illness. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to schizophrenia outcomes prior to the arrival of the drugs, you know what percentage of people, first episode people, would recover and be living successfully in the community 5 years later? And that meant this was before we had disability systems. Mm-hmm. So what percentage?
Well, I'm just thinking back on Courtney Harding's studies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So 2/3.
Yeah, I was thinking, I knew it was over 50%, but I didn't.
2/3.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And what Courtney Harding study did is it helps remind us of that sort of larger story that was in the research literature. This was true for patients today. Mm-hmm. But what do you see 2/3 of the people, getting work that are diagnosed with schizophrenia and doing well today? No way. So
I know that's true. I'm engaged in an experiment with Crestwood, which is a facility that I consult with, and they're a locked facility, but they keep trying to do things that promote recovery, and so they have a lot of rap stuff going on and DBT stuff. And a couple of years ago, they brought us in because they wanted to do peer support. So we started in one facility, San Diego, and we trained, I don't know, maybe 15 people and these are people on conservatorship in a locked facility. These are people for whom hope has not been held for a while.
Yeah.
And we graduated, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. I'm going to say we graduated 15 or something like that.
Wow.
And they just now finished their third class, and they have already I'm going to say 12 to 15 people employed.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, in various Crestwood facilities. It needs to be a lot more because we know that one or two people of any discipline can't change much. But if we got a critical mass in each facility, we would have a really amazing situation going on. It's already amazing.
I think that story, what you just told is, and that's a story even outside the question of medications. Because what that program was doing was, what is it doing? It's providing people with hope,
Yes. Yeah.
providing people with an avenue where they can feel proud of themselves, right?
Where they
And
can give
not just
back.
they can give back. They're not seeing themselves as disabled.
Right.
They start earning money.
Yes.
Now, what do they do if they go out and meet people socially? They don't have to say like I'm on disability or I've got a mental illness and I can't work. Well, this was even in a locked facility. But they can start saying, "Oh, I'm a peer worker. I
Yeah.
help other people to recovery."
Yes.
So
Yes.
quite apart from whether they're on drugs or not, that's giving them a new environment, a new uh, sort of personhood to grow into,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
and that is so powerful.
It's employment, I keep saying, is the best treatment of anything we do, just because all the things you just listed.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think, if and you hear people talk about this, if you just focus on giving people jobs and meaning in their life and,
Mhm.
and that sort of thing, um, and a place to live,
Yeah,
right?
that helps a lot.
Shelter. Um, that alone would improve outcomes so much. And then if you
Yes.
had some sort of selective use of drugs, okay, that could be good too.
Mm.
But the point is environment matters, right? And you know what environment matters, right? I know environment matters.
Yeah, yeah.
If you've ever been, we've all had setbacks in life and we start feeling crappy when we have, and our minds start racing on us and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So we all know this. So why do we think that people who get diagnosed with major disorders, they just have a problem inside their head and they don't have a problem with how they're interacting in the world?
We stop looking at everything but the brain,
Yes.
you know, and a lot of it's not about the brain.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing. The brain is built to be responsive to your environment.
Yes, yes,
The brain doesn't exist in isolation like this
right,
little thing on a shelf. It's
right.
that's who we are. We're built to be responsive to our environment. So environment matters.
Yeah, yeah. So epidemic, that's where you looked at the longer term effects. And I don't remember if you looked at PTSD in that book.
I didn't because basically I looked at the major disorders
Okay.
by this with the one more frequently diagnosed.
Hmm.
I also felt PTSD is a little different from like
It
depression.
is. It is. Yeah.
That it's so tied to trauma, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So we know that there's an environmental element to PTSD, whereas sometimes with
Yes.
depression, it was always something in your brain and schizophrenia.
Yes. Yeah. Internal
But
versus external.
I literally looked at four. I looked at depression, I looked at psychosis, schizophrenia, I looked at bipolar, where are all they coming from and what were their
Yeah.
outcomes, and
Yeah.
ADHD, since all the kids were getting it.
Yeah.
And that book made a splash for this reason. A, the evidence is quite convincing that is compiled over time, over like a 50-year period,
Mhm.
that the conclusion is, in fact, that the drugs worsen outcomes in the aggregate. That doesn't mean, but compared to natural recovery rates.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's a real call to do something differently. That's number one.
Yes. Yes.
Second, though, there is again even a real message of hope and optimism here, which is that these can be episodic disorders unless, and this was a famous saying by psychiatrists, unless we do something to turn them chronic. And that's, of course, what we do so often.
Yes.
And functionally impaired and all that sort of thing. And it's really interesting. Part of the functional impairment is, boy, you see a dramatic drop in people forming long-term relationships. I'm talking about intimate relationships.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So you have that. And then part of the book was, well, why don't we know this? And so the last third of the book told about how, in essence, with DSM-3, when it was published in 1980, Psychiatry decided to tell a story about a disease model, but they didn't have science behind it. But once they adopt that conception, which is going to boost guild interest, what happens? Pharmaceutical companies start paying money to academic psychiatrists to be their thought leaders and such. And suddenly we had pharmaceutical money funding a story that was being told by people with great prestige in our society. I'm talking about academic psychiatrists, which told of chemical imbalances being fixed in the brain, validated diseases, great new drugs. And as they were telling the story, and that's what's in Anatomy of an Epidemic, that's not what the science was showing. So what you see in Anatomy of an Epidemic is a story of how society was being misled, misinformed by the very people that we trust to be reliable narrators of their own science. So it becomes a story of betrayal.
Yes, yes.
And that
just get that, just go back a minute to something you said about a side effect of the drugs is an impact on intimate relationships. And I would say relationships in general, because something happens when a person is on drugs, especially heavy psychotropics, that I just see a breakdown in connecting and connection. And then to take that a little bit further, let's go into intimacy, is most of them, even antidepressants, have a huge impact on one's sex drive and interest in other people. So when that's gone, you lose the thing that makes us most human and keeps us well, and that's connecting.
Absolutely. We are beings that crave relationships.
Yes.
We crave being with the others. It's really hard to be by yourself.
Yeah.
And we're meant to be social. And you're exactly right. You find all these drugs, whether it be the benzodiazepines, the antidepressants, the antipsychotics, or the stimulants, they diminish our social reaction with others. And often we don't realize it, but they do diminish it. And one of the things, Lori, that I found very interesting is, and this sort of came up when I went to a place where for really disturbed kids in California, when I was reporting Anatomy of an Epidemic. And those kids, when they arrived, because they'd been kicked out of all their hospitals. These were the worst kids, the most disturbed kids in California. No one wanted them. Foster care places didn't want them. Hospitals didn't want them. They came to this place called, I think it was called the Seneca Center. And the psychiatrist at that time, when they came in, he did a life story about them, what had happened to them. But they all came in medicated up the kazoo, right? These are little kids, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12. They were on 5 drugs, 6 kids, and they could hardly pull their head off the thing. But here's the thing he found. Not only could they not form sort of emotions toward their mentors, because they had, like 22, 23-year-olds, but the mentors couldn't feel very close to them. In other words, relationship is a two-way thing. You need feedback to feel this, to have it arise from you. And then what he found was and his belief was that kids learn to control their behavior or organize their behavior by modeling their behavior on other people. And they need to have people that they care about in their lives in order to do this modeling process. And he began taking all the kids off their medication. Okay. Now, probably because their brains are more flexible, there were sort of withdrawal problems and acts up for about 3-4 weeks afterwards, but the kids didn't seem to have these extended problems. And what he found was once they were off medication, even though sometimes they would be, pretty wild, emotional, all these things, they could start forming bonds.
Interesting.
With the mentors, and the mentors started appreciating the kids.
Well, yes, because then you get the connecting going on.
Exactly. And that's what the drugs are robbing. They're robbing that connection, that relationship.
Well, I see that in I'm trying not to talk too much because I don't want to take up too much time being myself. But I see this in community programs, a little bit in Crestwood, and then also between case managers and people that live in the communities and so forth. And that is, their superpower is the relationship,
Absolutely.
but they don't use it. I mean, the clinical, whatever they call themselves,
Yeah.
don't use it. They rely on these jargony psychiatric terms to figure out who the person is, and then that's who the person is.
Yeah, they're their
And
diagnosis.
it's just like you're saying, I think because the person is overly medicated, isn't that interested to get involved with. I spoke to a group a couple days ago and I said, you know, you've got to see these people disguised as mental patients. That's a disguise. These are
Yeah,
heroes, these are warriors. They have lived through a system that has repeatedly failed them, and now
yeah, yeah.
they're here and we have a chance to turn them around. But, don't see them as a mental patient, and
You know,
don't see yourself as some kind of a treater. Be a person,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. You know, when I was doing Anatomy of an Epidemic, I spoke to a lot of people that had been in hospitals and all, probably 75 or more, whatever. And the story I heard for those who had gotten better, and many who had gotten off medications, always included one thing, and that was someone believed in them
Yes,
and saw
yes,
them as a person and presented them, treated them not as a diagnosis, but told them you have this possibility, but treat them as a person.
yes, yeah,
And
yeah,
they came across not as a quote therapist,
right.
but as another parent, someone that this is like the weird tension, of course, because if you're close to someone, you have affection for that person, right?
Yes,
It doesn't
yes,
mean sexual tension all the time, but there is an affection. I feel
yes,
affectionate for
yes,
this
a
person,
compassion.
a compassion. But somehow we've decided that professionals can't have this emotional connection to
Oh,
people.
I know this drives me crazy. These boundaries and professional that's what I think that's what's making peers so effective
Yeah,
is
because they don't have those boundaries, right?
they don't have that stuff. They can just be a friend. They can go for a walk. They can hang out. Yeah.
And the peers can say, "This is what my life's been like," or "This is what's
Yes.
going on
Yeah.
with me." Yeah,
Yeah. It's a two-way street.
but I never heard someone who was doing better or recovered or out working or had moved into a relationship who told a story of recovery that didn't involve a connection to another human being.
Yeah.
Not
And it
once.
and it could be anybody. It could be the guy at the 7-Eleven. It could be a nephew. Now and then it would be a treatment type person, but often it was just a regular person.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know what else? Sometimes someone came along was how much a dog could be a stepping
Oh,
stone,
I know.
right?
Yeah.
Because a dog likes you when you come home, you know,
Yeah. Or cat, even a cat.
or a cat. I meant a pet, basically.
Yeah. 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 Well, I want to have time to talk about Star D. Could you
Okay.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this goes to this sort of persistent theme that we've been talking about, Lori, that's in both Anatomy of an Epidemic and, Mad in American Anatomy of an Epidemic, and actually was in a third book I co-wrote called Psychiatry and Influence.
Hmm.
And that is the public has been betrayed by a psychiatric profession that hasn't been honest about its own research.
Mhm.
Okay? When they get negative results, they don't tell the public about it, or they spin results, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Well, the STAR D study is the primary example of this sort of betrayal of the American public. And what's amazing is it's 1924, it's 2024, and this dates back to 2005. Now, I've been writing about this fraud ever since about 2010. But what happened was there was something that was published this summer that really nailed down the fraud. So, why is this important? The STAR D study, when it was conceived of, it was the largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. and it was funded by the NIMH to the tune of $35 million.
Wow.
And here was the idea behind it. Those clinical trials conducted by pharmaceutical companies aren't conducted in real world patients. By that they mean is there's so much inclusion and exclusion criteria that most people with depression can't qualify for those trials. Because maybe they have suicidal or they have co-occurring, that sort of thing. So the question was, well, what is the impact of antidepressants in real world patients that show up at the outpatient door? And not only over the short term, but over the long term. And the hypothesis was, well, some people may not respond to a first antidepressant, but then we can switch them to another. And if that doesn't work, we can switch them to psychotherapy plus an antidepressant. And we'll get, and after we'll give them 4 tries to remit. That's the first part, okay? And then for those that do remit, where their symptoms go away, we'll keep them in care. We'll pay them to stay in care. We'll show that we can keep them in care. And we'll show that in ordinary clinical care, we can keep them well. So the study was designed to show that antidepressants work in real world patients. They can get you to remit, meaning the symptoms supposedly disappear, and they can keep you well. And the message was stay in care. So here's what
stay on the medication.
Stay on the medication. That was the expected one.
Yeah. Okay.
So what did they report in October of 2005? That 70% of the 4,041 patients who entered the trial had remitted and were well at the end of 1 year. 70%.
Well, maybe off of medication?
No, supposedly this was like people on medication.
Okay. All right.
If they went off medication, basically they were dropped from the study.
Okay, of course.
Okay. So that was good news. The NIMH announced that was true, and this became the standard for the care. If the first drug doesn't work, do the second. And if that doesn't work, do a third. And eventually you'll find something that works, okay? And whenever the efficacy of antidepressants was questioned, this would be the finding that was trotted out. Even as late as 2022, it was being promoted in the New York Times as evidence of the efficacy of antidepressants. However, nothing like that actually happened in this study. What you find is that the real remission rate among people who were depressed enough to qualify the trial was 35% after one of these. In other words, that during one of these 4 treatment stages, 35% at the end of one of those 4 stages was doing well. And what happened was if you remitted well after the first drug, you were whisked into that follow-up trial, okay? You didn't have to stay well. So at some point, people had a day at the end of one of these 4 tries where they were well. Okay, the true remission rate was 35%, not 70%. And I can explain how they inflated that rate. And then what happened in the follow-up? At the end of 1 year, of the 4,041 patients who entered the study, there were only 108 who had remitted and stayed well and in the study to its 1 year end. That was a documented stay well rate under the protocol of 3%. Public was being told 70% remission rate.
Amazing.
Now, what was the fraud involved? The fraud involves several steps. One was that people who dropped out, so they came in, they got treated with the drug, and if they dropped out before coming back, they were supposed to be counted as treatment failures. Okay, but the investigators stopped counting them as treatment failures. They pretended they never entered the study. That's number one.
Oh, interesting.
Number two, there were 931 patients who weren't depressed enough to be eligible for the study. But they still got treated with drugs, and the researchers, they initially admitted in their very first paper, these people weren't depressed enough to be eligible. But then, of course, what they found of these people who weren't depressed enough to be eligible, they improved just a bit, they scored as remission, and they began counting them as remitted.
I
Okay.
see. Wow.
Even though they weren't eligible, they weren't
Yeah.
depressed enough to be considered.
Yeah.
That's the second. The third, the protocol said, we're going to use the HAM-D scale to measure outcomes. And during the visits, we're going to use an unvalidated scale called the QIDS, which is an unblinded thing to sort of see how they're doing. But outcomes will be on the HAM-D. Well, what they found was if they just reported the QIDS scores, it seemed like more were remitting. So by switching to QIDS, even though the protocol said this is not to be used to measure outcomes, they could report a higher remission rate. And finally, what they did was they just made up remissions. What they said is, well, if the people who dropped out had stayed in the trial to all four end, they would have remitted at a certain rate as those who did. And by that way, by those 4 ways, they turned a real world remission rate of 35% into 70%. And then they just didn't report in any sort of real way what happened to people in that year-long follow-up.
That's
and
remarkable.
And the guy who really figured this out was a guy named Ed Piggott. I mean, when I looked at the study, I knew something was wrong. I could see they switched endpoints, and I could see that they were just, some of these were theoretical remissions. And I had this weird thing, like they were including people that weren't depressed enough, but I really couldn't put it together. It was Ed Piggott who did, starting in 2010. And then he finally got access to the patient level data. He go back to all the case report forms, and they reported in the British Journal of Psychiatry in August that if they had followed the protocol, the real remission rate was 35%.
So that did get published, but then the American Psychiatric Association went with the 70%.
They just constantly talked about 70%.
And
now they won't retract the paper. Mad in America, the website I've been running, we detailed it. We wrote reports about this fraud and asked for a retraction of the paper because it was deliberate. There's a responsibility in scientific literature. If you find that findings are no longer reliable, you're supposed to retract it. And they didn't even respond to us.
Interesting.
Now, what has happened is Psychiatric Times, which is another publication, which usually is very friendly. After we made a big deal out of this, they did do an article and they said something's wrong here. So they sort of, this is a real question that needs to be answered. And they said this: if this is wrong, if the real rate was 35%, we've all been misled. And our protocols and our use of these drugs have been based on a falsehood. And we need to correct that. But think about that, Lori. You paid for this story. This study. All the taxpayers did.
Yeah.
And they lied to us about the results, and they hid the fact that nobody was basically well at the end of 1 year. Now, just to finish this study, at the same time, the NIMH was funding a study as what is the natural course of depression in unmedicated patients today? Because in the old days, you know what the outcome was at the end of 1 year? And this was even in hospitalized depressed patients. 85% would be well and out of the hospital.
Really?
Yeah. And of that, and of a cohort of, say, of 100 depressed patients, 50 patients would have one episode of depression would never become depressed again. So that was the understanding before the introduction of antidepressants.
Yeah.
So what did they find in this NIMH study of the outcomes at the end of 1 year in unmedicated patients? Now, remember, in the STAR-D, it was 3% documented stay well rate. In this study, it was 85%. Did you hear about that?
No, of course not.
Did they promote that finding? No, they promoted the fake finding from the STAR-D study.
So, you know what this does to me? I am not a conspiracy theorist person, but I have to ask myself, who's benefiting from this false narrative? Well, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, I guess the whole mental health system is, because the more people you make dependent on a system, even if they don't need to be dependent on it, then the more jobs you create, the more hospital beds you get to build, and the more money goes into pharmaceutical pockets. Am I being too
Yeah, I
jaded
wouldn't call
with
it,
that?
I know what you mean about a conspiracy theory, but it's not a conspiracy theory because you can show that there is this financial benefit.
Okay, good.
Okay?
I hate to think of myself as a conspiratorial
No,
theory.
no, the first thing is you can show there is this financial benefit. Then you can come on documents where they talk about basically we have to hide this bad data and in order to preserve this belief in the system.
Yeah.
And you can find, for example, where they were actually saying in the 1990s, listen, the low serotonin theory hasn't panned out. That's what they were saying to themselves.
Uh-huh.
They
Uh-huh.
kept saying it because it was a good way, A, to sell drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to understand psychiatry as an institution had rebranded itself in 1980 with this idea that these things are diseases of the brain. That
Okay.
was their new branding.
Yeah.
And that was their presentation to the public as doctors in white coats that treated real diseases of the brain. It was a way to elevate the
Mm-hmm.
status of psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
So they were invested in that story. Okay. And then the drug companies began paying academic psychiatrists to be their thought leaders, to be their consultants, to, uh, uh, ghost serve as, ghost authors on their papers.
Mm-hmm.
And they got paid big, big
Yeah. Yeah.
dollars to do
Yeah.
that. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars.
Hmm.
So why did those guys, there were some women, but it was a lot of men,
Mm-hmm.
uh, serve in that role because they benefited from it. Plus, they became the experts flew
Yeah.
around the world.
Yeah.
So you're not a conspiracy theory when you can detail and
Yes.
document the
Yeah.
financial motivation, the the difference between what the research showed and what they told us. That's not conspiracy.
Yeah.
That's
That's
just
that's
that's
just the
that's an
truth.
explication or
Yeah.
it's just, and from a journalistic point of view, it's just showing the truth, the underbelly of something. So it's a well supported story, and that's what I was telling to some extent in Mad in America, to more extent in Anatomy of an Epidemic, but to full extent in Psychiatry Influenced, because that book came out of a lab that was set up at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University to study institutional corruption.
Hmm.
How do institutions betray their public duty? So it didn't come out of a conspiracy theory place.
Right.
It came out of a laboratory for studying institutional corruption and looking at the forces, financial and
Yeah.
otherwise, guild
Yeah.
forces that cause this corruption within an institution. And so that's what we did in Psychiatry Influence. So not a conspiracy theory.
Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, it's just becoming well versed in what actually has happened, and it's a documented story.
Well, even not knowing that, when you work in the system, you see it. It's
Yeah,
just
sure.
here. I mean, there's no narrative for it. You just know it in your heart, that something's not right here. So, we have to go. I know you're running out of time. Let me just ask you one more question. You have been hammering away at this for a while now, chipping away at it. And I've been reading other authors. I've been reading this guy. You probably know him, Rob Winpond.
Oh yeah, so Rob used to work for me.
Oh, okay. All right. So he's really radical on a lot of this stuff. And then I've been reading this guy. I love this guy. Alex Bernard.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
haven't read that book, but I know of it. Yeah.
it's an excellent book. Um, anyway, so you've been hammering away at it. Other people are starting to chip away. What's going to happen here?
Well, Lori, that's a great question. On the one hand, the narrative has shifted. Okay,
Yes, it has.
that narrative of great progress collapsed.
Yeah.
That narrative of drugs that were so efficient and breakthrough medications, that's
Yeah.
collapsed because
Well,
everybody can
that's
see
big. That's a big
that's big.
deal.
We know the chemical imbalance story didn't pan out. There's increasing admission that long-term outcomes are poor. There's increasing admission that we need to rethink this. And those calls are coming from the United Nations. They're coming from the World Health Organization, saying that this basically disease model has proven to be a failure in country after country.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense that this pathologizing of our kids is a huge mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So what has changed is that story of great progress that was told to us in the 90s has collapsed. We know the disease model didn't pan out. And so we're now at this moment where it seems like new paradigms of thought can take hold. And there are hope, there's the benefits of peer work and that sort of
Yes,
thing.
yes.
And there's the benefits of providing housing and environmental things and
Mm-hmm.
jobs.
Yeah.
So the narrative is shifting
Yes,
in a profound
that's
way,
true.
but the diagnosing of people continues unabated,
Yes.
slotting kids in so that they see themselves through this sort of impaired, framework.
Yes. Yeah.
And the drug use hasn't stopped either. I mean, it's not, by the drug use, I mean the prescribing of drugs. That keeps
Yes.
going up and up and up.
Yes. That's what I keep seeing. I mean, I, I love what you're saying, but when I look out over the system, it's like, the whole idea of what you find out in research doesn't hit the road until 15 or 17 years later. So maybe that's what's happening here. We now know it's not right, but we're still doing the same old stuff on the ground.
Yeah, I think the thing is, we haven't built the systems for not doing the same things.
Yeah, well, I think we don't know what to do.
We don't know what to do. We've lost to know what to do for sure.
Yeah, we just don't know what to do.
And one of the things that I've seen I have been at this a long time, but I've seen, some experimental programs. I remember when I came to Recovery Innovations, but for example, there were places that have sprung up in Norway, Finland, Israel, where they stopped medicating everyone and they
Hmm.
did build environments.
Hmm.
And if you go visit those where even psychotic people aren't medicated, and I'm talking about chronic patients,
Mhm.
psychotic patients, you often find they're very lively. They're not people sitting around doing nothing, and it's
Yeah,
fun actually.
they're
And
not drooling.
what's that?
They're not drooling.
They're not drooling. They're fun, and they have wild imaginations and stuff. I'm not saying it's all great. I'm not saying that people don't misbehave and act out and that sort of thing, and there's difficult times, but it's a different experience. And what those places are showing that it can be done, even with extremely disturbed people by categorization.
Yeah,
And that when that's done, many people just do get their lives back
yeah, yes,
and,
yeah,
and move into job.
yes.
One of the greatest individual accounts of this is this woman, boy, I forget her name, that was 34 years of age when I met her. She had been hospitalized since she was 12, on and
Mm.
off, 240 hospitalizations,
Oh my gosh.
had been given 31 different psychiatric drugs over the time. When she came to this hospital that had been set up outside of Oslo for medication-free treatment, it was in sort of thing. She was on something like, I don't know, 14 drugs, 18 drugs,
Yeah, yeah.
seen as chronically ill and hopeless. She had spent the last year basically in belts and stuff in the traditional hospital,
Mm. Yeah,
constantly watched under suicide watch. Well, in this hospital, the first thing they did is they took her on a vacation to Mallorca.
great.
So we think you need a vacation. But then she went with a nurse to build this thing. Anyway, a year later, she was down to 2 drugs, lost a lot of weight, and was now working as a peer and living in her own apartments.
I love that story.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good one to end on. So
Okay, that is a good one to end on. Thank
it
you
tells
so
that
much.
we've got to grab these understanding that things can be different and people
Yeah,
can get their lives back.
yeah, yeah.
And we have to stop seeing each other through this lens of pathology for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so very much. I learned so much. I think I already know what you're going to say, and then I always learn so much when I hear you again. So thanks ever so much. And this will kind of go on.
it was a joy having this conversation with you, Lori.
Oh, yeah, good. Okay, my dear, take care.
You too now. Ciao.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay, bye-bye. Well, there you have it, Robert Whitaker, an amazing guy who has taken a lot of abuse as anybody who wants to change anything does, a lot of abuse for the truth that he's bringing to us. Yeah. And if you want to know more, just Google Robert Whitaker. There's a whole lot there. Or Google Mad in America. That's an organization that Robert has and brings lots of people into to tell their point of view about things. So lots of really interesting stuff to read there. And some articles on peer support that I think you'll find interesting. So that's it for today. And always good to spend a little time with you. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you next time.